I just to let you know the recording is in progress. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Gilliland, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Susan?
Thank you, Ron. Do you want to put that slide up, Ron?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Feenstra tonight. Many of you already know John as a terrific birder and a pioneer of Southern California birding. John is co-author of the essential checklist to the pelagic birds of Southern California. John was raised in New Jersey, and it was in high school that John was introduced to birds on a field trip to southeastern Arizona. And despite a strong interest in talent for birds and birding, John pursued academics where he excelled in physical chemistry and eventually moved to Pasadena and earned his PhD from Caltech. While studying, he became very active in Southern California birding. After completing his PhD, it wasn't long before John declared that it was birds that were really his full-time passion, and he boldly left the corporate world, and lucky for us, he returned to Southern California, where he resides with his young family. Today, John is an ecological consultant and travels the world as a senior tour leader for Wings Birding Tours. And whether it's on the ocean, in the mountains, traversing the deserts, navigating the jungles, or birding the crushing urban LA landscape, John birds it all. Los Angeles Birders is very pleased to have John as a valuable member of our board and as our speaker tonight. So please welcome Dr. John Feenstra.
Okay, thank you, Susan. It's time for me to do stuff here. Okay. All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me in the back. Yeah, thank you all for tuning into this. I started out with thinking of a talk or doing a talk on the seabirds of Southern California, and when I got through like 60 or 70 species of everything from the tubenoses through the alcids and Jaegers and gulls and terns and boobies and all the tropic birds, I realized that just was not going to happen. And so I trimmed it down to tubenoses. And when I went through all the species of that was also not going to happen. So I had to trim it down further into it should be the regular tubenoses of Southern California. So I could actually talk about something, spend a little bit of time on each species, and hopefully make it all make sense. Although it's still going to be kind of a ramble, and I don't want it to sound too much like a book report on Steve Howell's Tubenoses of North America, which you should all have. I'm going to plug that book. It's going to have a deeper dive into just about everything that I'm talking about. Since I still have to cover a number of species and general Southern California interesting facts. It's going to, I don't have a lot of time to spend on each one of these. So if you want to know more, I refer you to Steve's book. Although, this is my personal touch on this stuff, as I'll get into a lot of birding on the ocean and identifying seabirds is beyond just what the books tell you about plumage. It is your impressions of these birds, and everybody has a little bit different of an impression. And I think everybody's impressions are all valuable when it comes to an overall picture of some of the identification of these trickier species. So with that, I'm going to cover a little bit of what makes Southern California interesting for these birds, and then move on from there. So this is a map of the Southern California Bight, which is that little notch of ocean between Point Conception, where the coastline turns inland and continues in like a little notch down to about Ensenada in Baja. And the area is characterized by, of course, the Channel Islands, but also the Coronado Islands, which you can't really see on this map, and an extension of the continental shelf out away from the Pacific coast. I'll see if my mouse cursor here, out to about here. The shelf line, the continental shelf, essentially runs down the coast of California, but where Point Conception turns in, the shelf line basically keeps going south. So there's this, relatively shallow area in the area called the Southern California Bight. And in that Southern California Bight is the Channel Islands, a bunch of little banks and canyons and basins and things, and a bunch of interesting underwater features. So with all that, the one of the things that makes this area so interesting and diverse is that the California current, which is a cold and nutrient-rich current that runs south along the California coast, continues basically along the shelf edge, but at certain times of year, particularly in the spring, the prevailing northwest winds are blowing this current out, over the Southern California Bight, like a little bit more inland. Although the main part of the current does continue south, and what happens is because it's continuing south, it generates a countercurrent of warmer water that runs up the coast from Mexico, and then this forms a counterclockwise eddy over the Southern California Bight. So these are the sort of major underwater currents that are all going all the time, to various degrees, depending on winds and storms and weather. And then in addition to that, there's various other little, say, micro currents or short-lived currents caused by, say, the wind, like funneling through the straits of the northern Channel Islands, or offshore, the movement of water from offshore from Santa Ana winds, or areas where warmer water and cooler water interact with each other. But what this all really boils down to is upwelling and food. So upwelling is caused by when one of these oceanographic phenomena occur, and it brings the nutrient-rich stuff from the bottom of the ocean, where dead things have been settling, up to the surface, where it can interact with the sunlight and be eaten by plankton, beginning of phytoplankton, photosynthetic plankton, and the and zooplankton, which forms the foundation of the marine food chain, and then little fish and birds and marine mammals and all that stuff. So these areas of upwelling aren't ubiquitous over the entire ocean, or even over the Southern California Bight. They're localized to these places where upwelling occurs, and sometimes, as I noted, there are a number of permanent features, islands and banks and canyons and ridges and stuff that currents bump up against, and water is pushed to the surface. Those are permanent features of upwelling. And then there's all these temporary features of upwelling, like those areas where different water of different temperatures interacts, and it causes a mixing, and water moves off to the side, and deeper water from underneath comes up to the surface, etc. So as many of you who've been on pelagic trips know, it's not always the way we expect it to be when we go out there. Sometimes we leave a harbor and we say, okay, we're going to go way out here to this, the San Juan Seamount, 100 miles off the coast, because that's a good area of upwelling. And we get there and it's just windy and horrible and we don't see anything, because maybe the upwelling just isn't happening right then. Or on the way in, we find some strange windbreak from, between the Channel Islands that's caused an ephemeral area of upwelling. And there's tons of birds and tuna and dolphin and all sorts of things like that. So we know how variable this stuff is. But what it basically means is that you have areas with lots of huge areas where there's very little and no food, and then very small areas where there is food, and those areas are moving. and both for birds and birders. I kind of think of it as driving out into the desert to go birding on a good migrant day or something, and passing through lots and lots of rather uninteresting and unpopulated creosote scrub, and getting to an oasis where there's lots of stuff. It's just that oasis is moving around, and you have an idea of where it is, but not exactly. And then here's just another map of this is sea surface temperature, kind of giving an idea of the cold water of the California current along the west edge of the SoCal Bight on the shelf edge, and the warmer counter current coming up along the coast from Mexico, and areas of temperature of thermocline in a place where the temperature changes abruptly from warmer to cooler would be an area that could be predicted to have some upwelling and potentially some seabirds. But so we have tube noses, and tube noses are adapted to these conditions. They are the birds out there that are traveling huge distances to find these moving oases of food in an otherwise kind of rather lifeless place. And some birds travel longer than others. Some of the longest migrations or transits that we know of in birds are done by seabirds, and they are the things that are adapted for this. So this is a close-up of a northern fulmar to emphasize its tube nose. Those on the upper side of the bill, and these are called the naricorns, these plates here, and they encase the nostril tube, and through that nostril tube, excess salt is secreted. Tube noses, most of them never see fresh water except when it rains, so they're getting their moisture from salt water and have to get rid of that salt somehow. It's coming out of their nose. It's also still a nose, and seabirds have a very enhanced sense of smell, especially since most birds have very little sense of smell. Seabirds have a very good sense of smell, and that allows them to find, say, a whale carcass, miles and miles away by smelling it, and then navigating there. They're strong flyers. They have dense waterproof plumage. Many of them are good divers. So in addition to flying around and sitting on the water and feeding on the surface, they can also dive pretty deep. They usually, or many of them, breed on remote islands in the mostly in the southern oceans, but also in the northern hemisphere on volcanic rocks out in the middle of the ocean, or on remote cliff faces, places without any predators. And these birds that nest in sort of tropical or more areas where the marine life, the upwelling or the food supply isn't very good, means that many of these birds have to travel for huge distances just to eat and bring food back to their nests. Some of them, will be gone from a nest for a couple of weeks in order to get food to bring back to feed young birds. So they're really serious flying machines, basically, and truly adapted to this pretty rough environment. So as far as moving on to some identification stuff, this is, and I have one. My next chart too is also it's not very scientific. I didn't go any primary sources or anything here. I just gleaned some numbers from Howell's Tube Nose book and from various field guides. And really, it's again, not too scientific, but just to give an impression and to give everybody the idea of how large or small these things actually are. So I didn't put albatrosses on here. They're about twice the size of or wingspan of the flesh-footed, pink-footed shearwaters, but everything else. So these are all the species I'll be talking about. But everything from a least storm petrel, which is about the size of a barn swallow, to pink-footed shearwater, which is a little bit smaller than a ringbill or a Heermann skull. And I threw in a few other familiar birds just to give all of you an idea of the sizes of these things. And size is a really difficult thing to deal with on a boat. And I always, I'm on lots of boats, and people, oh, it's 100 meters out or 100 feet out or 2 boat lengths or something like that. And these are all really difficult distances to gauge. And obviously things are further out, look smaller. And if it's birds by itself, it's sometimes really difficult to gauge size. When you have the fortune of having some of these birds together, it gives you a good idea of well, first of all, it helps in identification. And it's particularly helpful for something like black or least storm petrel or short-tailed or sooty shearwaters. But it just, you really changes your perspective on how big or how small these things actually really are. So I took this one step further, and this is also very non-scientific since I just took numbers from various field guides and things, but I kind of wanted to quantify, I suppose, the elegance in flight of the tube noses that I'll be talking about. And that's wing loading, and I'll mention this multiple times as I get into the species account. But plumage on seabirds is pretty muted, browns and grays and white. And a number of these species have very, very similar plumage. When you're looking at a photograph, you can get a lot more information on plumage than you can from, say, a tiny bird like a storm petrel that's moving quickly in swells while you're on a moving boat and the bird's getting further away, or it's just, the finest details of plumage are a really difficult thing to get on a boat. And something like, but the way that it flies and its shape and just its general impression is something that's that it's very helpful in identification, and it's something that the more time you spend on a boat looking at these birds, the more you pick up and the more useful it becomes in identifying them. So I just took the wingspan and the average wingspan divided by the average mass. And there's a lot of problems with this because these things have different masses, different times a year when they're migrating or before they migrate, or when they're breeding or whatever. And there is variation in the wingspan as well. But this is some broad strokes just to give an idea of what of how these birds will move in the air. Species like sooty shearwater is a great example because it's at one end of the spectrum. It's kind of a heavy-bodied bird with narrow wings, and when you see sooty shearwaters flying around, they fly in a certain way because they have a big, heavy body and they have narrow wings. Whereas something like a Buller's shearwater, which is a light-bodied, long-winged bird, moves very differently. And when comparing something like sooty and short-tailed shearwater, pretty notorious identification problem. Plumage is often not that helpful, but the way that the bird moves in the air can be helpful because they move differently because they have a different, there's a different load being carried by their wings. We think of some of the most elegant flyers, Murphy's, the pterodroma petrels, Murphy's petrel and Cook's petrel are very dynamic in the air, and they make moving around in the air something kind of some sort of crazy ballet. And then the storm petrels are tiny little things that are move in also an entirely different way. So anyway, just keep this in mind, both as I talk about plumage of birds, but also as a feature to think about next time you're out on a boat. So first I'm going to talk about the shearwaters. So the shearwaters, fulmar, and the pterodroma petrels are all in the family Procellariidae. So they're all petrels. And I'm going to talk about them first. So here's some pink-footed shearwaters and some sooty shearwaters. Shearwaters with respect to fulmars and the pterodroma petrels Kind of long bodies, long necks, long bills, long wings, usually held pretty straight, long pointed wings. These are among the most familiar tube noses to all of us, because things like black-finnered shearwater you can see from shore. And if you are going to go out on any pelagic trip off of Southern California and you see any seabird, any tube noses, they're probably going to be shearwaters. And they're some of our more common and numerous tube noses that you see on any boat. So with that, talk about black-finnered shearwaters, are probably most familiar one, because you don't even need to go on a pelagic trip to see black-finnered shearwaters. In fact, you probably see more black-finnered shearwaters in a few hours scoping from a coastal promontory than you would out on a boat trip, which typically go further out than black-finnered shearwaters want to be. So this is of all of the larger tube noses. This one is our most local. Pink-footed and sooties and short-tailed shearwaters all breed in the southern hemisphere, but these breed off of Mexico, and they come here in the non-breeding season, and they can be pretty numerous, in thousands off Southern California. And they're regularly seen from shore. A familiar sort of what we often say is black and white shearwater, but they're not black and white. They're sort of a smudgy gray brown above and a smudgy white below. They have dark undertail coverts, and they have a very fast, snappy wing beat with short little glides. And it's like, if you see these from a coastal promontory through a scope and you're looking at them as far away as you can see, and you see flashes of dark and light, their regular snappy flapping is sort of reminiscent of something like maybe a large alcid or something like that. So here's a close up of one. You can see the dark undertail coverts, hence the name black-finnered shearwater. This one's actually in pretty bright light, which can sometimes make this even seem more overexposed and give the over-optimistic impression that maybe it's a Manx shearwater. So, but dark bill, dark feet, smudgy. Here's a couple more. It looked like maybe a worn-looking bird on the right, and a fresher bird on the left. And that one on the left's got a really beat-up outer primary. So a lot of seabirds will just molt a few primaries just to keep themselves going, to not lose their optimum flying ability. Maybe that's what's going on there. Move on. Black-finnered shearwaters also seem to be, at least of all the shearwaters I've seen lots of, seem to be the one most prone to having leucistic individuals. So in a big flock of black-finnered shearwaters, sometimes you see something that looks like this. A normal looking one on the left and a leucistic one on the right. It still has dark undertail coverage, so it's not a Manx shearwater, but it's a pretty weird looking bird. So sometimes we see those out there. Moving to the other end, our largest local shearwater is pink-footed shearwater. And actually, I put it after black-finnered shearwater because other than without looking at the bill or the feet or the size or the way it flies, its plumage is pretty similar to black-finnered shearwater. It's kind of a smudgy bird above and kind of smudgy white below. It has more smudging below than black-finnered shearwater does, but superficially pretty similar in plumage. Now, of course, it does have a pink bill and does have with a dark tip and pink feet, but it's a large, say, dark and light shearwater. It flies very different. It's a much bigger bird than black-finnered shearwater, and I think of pink-footed shearwaters as far as shearwaters go, they're the ones that make it look easy. They have a very chilled out kind of flight style with strong wing beats, lots of gliding, but in a kind of a lazy, like this is what I do sort of way. And I know, as I said, this is my personal touch on this stuff. So if you go out on a pelagic trip, just remember me saying that and see if you agree with me or not. They're here. They're one of our more common shearwaters. Often in some sizable flocks outside the Channel Islands, especially between those little straits of the Channel Islands and in the fall in particular. Although we get them, in the spring through the fall. and then they're breeders around the Juan Fernandez Islands off Chile. So here's a couple more pink-footed shearwaters, a close-up of one. You can see it's the tube nose, the tubes of the tube nose on the main picture. It's pretty strong hooked bill, dark bill tip. That dark bill tip is that's one of my favorite bird names is Maxillary unguis. It's just a really cool name. That's what that little plate is called on the top of the bill there at the tip. Dark, smudgy, gray brown on the back, pale on the front. The inset is in pretty bright light, calm water. Almost looks kind of blonde in that light. A really washed out brown one, but again, pink bill. It's pink feet. There's a couple more pictures of pink-footed shearwaters, just to give you an idea. That one on the lower right looks like it's in some pretty good wind, and that's a thing. The way that, and I guess I'm sort of describing when I'm talking about the way that these birds fly, I'm sort of considering them in moderate conditions, in very calm conditions, in very windy conditions, flying directly away from the boat. All seabirds move a little bit differently. That one in the bottom right is probably on a very windy day, and is catching some wind and in its wings like a sail, and tipping up in a way that is putting its wings like perpendicular with the plane of the earth, kind of a classic pterodroma sort of pose, but all of the shearwaters will do that on occasion. And this is the main picture here has a couple of sooty shearwaters in the foreground as well. You can see these long, straight, broad wings, and they're just the general color of pink-footed shearwater. It's a big bird. So now much less big, moving down in size, but also staying with the light below, dark above theme, is Buller's shearwater. And this is a much less common shearwater in our waters than the other ones I've spoken of. And we get these in the late summer, fall, usually out over like the outer banks, out on the edge of the shelf, like places like the Cortez Banks or Tanner Bank, out that way. It's a shearwater about the size of a sooty shearwater, which it's in the same picture with here, but a very different looking bird, and also a very different shaped bird. It's a very, like a picture over here. Here's a picture from the back. So from the back, it's got this sort of distinctive, kind of with the classic pterodroma like M pattern, dark gray and black M pattern on it, on its back, and very white below. Unlike a pterodroma petrel, it's got kind of has a longer neck and smaller head and more slender bill, without visibility of obvious plates. It has especially compared to sooty shearwater, has a very low wing loading, so small body and long wings, and as such has a buoyant, described in books as buoyant, but a very floating flight. It moves with its wings slightly bowed, and it just floats over the waves, capable of moving very quickly without doing a lot of work. And that's partly optimized for patrolling over tropical oceans and needing to cover very large distances between meals. Here's a picture of the underside of Buller's shearwater. Again, very clean white below. It's a very contrasty bird. This one's picked up into some nice wind. Long, slender, dark bill. The feet are concealed in the undertail coverts. Picture on the right. There's an albatross in the foreground, but it's Buller's shearwater with the wings up. Again, very clean white below, very distinctive shearwater, unlikely to be confused with any of our other regular shearwaters. Over optimistic observers could make this into could try to make it into a pterodroma, but again, a differently shaped bird from them as well. Moving on to probably our most common shearwater, and one of the more common ones of on Earth is sooty shearwater. It's our regular dark-bodied shearwater, so just a brown shearwater with contrasting white coverts on the underwings. So oftentimes we get them. They're in the spring through fall. And you can see them from shore, they're near shore, they're way offshore, they're kind of everywhere, sometimes in large groups. They arrive to areas like the California coast in order to molt after breeding in the southern oceans. Some sooty shearwaters have been tracked. I think it's the longest known migration of a bird species doing a figure 8 around the Pacific. It's like 40,000 miles or something like that in a year. And this is the bird, if you remember from the original early chart, that it's has very heavy wing loading. So this is a heavy bodied bird with I guess compared to the other ones, proportionally shorter wings. They do a lot of flapping, and to me, they really look like they're beating the air when sooty shearwaters flap. They have a hard wing beat, and they do a lot of it. Now, of course, in strong wind, they can really take to the skies in some pretty impressive arcs and dives. And that's what they need. They are, because they have heavy wing loading, they are particularly dependent on strong winds to get them around the oceans and help them find food. That figure 8 migration around the Pacific Ocean is they're following through the windiest, most food-rich places to get all of their nutritional needs. So here's a couple of pictures of sooty shearwater. Yeah, it's a sort of a chocolate brown shearwater. And one on the left looks like it's got some fishing line at its feet. And on the right, a little bit of the underwing. You can see it's got white underwings. Both of these are it's especially that one on the right looks particularly heavy bodied, but even more so in this picture. So the one on the right, bird in molt, is, you see the white flashes of on the underwings, and the reduced wing size and the posture of the bird, and the heaviness of the bird makes it look like a duck or a cormorant or something, a big heavy bodied thing. The one on the left is a fresh bird, and one of the and this is a feature pointed out in Howell's book that I've not been able to see in the field, but looks like you can see it in photographs, is the dark lines in the shafts of the feathers in the primary coverts, these lines right here. And that's a thing that sooty shearwaters apparently have, and short-tailed shearwaters don't, or at least most sooties have it and most short-taileds don't. The underwing, the white underwing flash, often pointed out as a field mark, but separating short-tailed and sooty shearwaters is of limited use, at least to me. It's like, well, it's brighter and more contrasty with the dark feathers in the sooty shearwater, and it's more of a uniform, or sooty is kind of like wedge shaped, and it's more of a uniform bar in short-tailed shearwater. It's a really hard thing to see, and the shape of the bird and the way that it flies tend to be a more useful field mark to me for that identification. I'll show more when I get to short-tailed shearwaters, but the notice on these sooty shearwaters, this one on the right, particularly the shape of the head, a very sloping forehead into a long kind of heavy bill. That'll be more clear when I show short-tailed shearwaters. Here for a few more sooties. Again, you can notice like the heavy bodies, does have a pretty brightly contrasting white wedges in the underwings. You can see it even from the birds flying away, and then the bird in the inset. So here's a sooty shearwater. In the inset is a leucistic sooty shearwater, very strange looking thing with some other sooty shearwaters and a pinkfoot in the foreground. And then the main picture shows a sooty shearwater on the water with some black-finnered shearwaters, just for relative size. Is a bigger bird than the black-finnered shearwaters. So moving on to short-tailed shearwater, and as I've said a few times, is one of the most notorious identification problems in pelagic birding off of California. And that's not sooty shearwater is not sooty shearwater is super common. The short-tailed shearwater of Southern California is uncommon. They're around, you can find them, but they're not a particularly common bird. They're usually not that far offshore. Sometimes they're with black-finnered shearwaters, to kind of give you an idea of where they are in distribution wise, and usually a winter bird. Short-tailed shearwater is smaller than sooty shearwater. It has less wing loading, and it's probably when you look at some of the other pictures, the smaller body of the bird might be noticeable. It's noticeable when seeing a live flying bird. The head of a short-tailed shearwater, and you can see it in this photo, is quite rounded, and the bill is small and slender. The short tail is not any shorter tailed than sooty shearwater. Very often the feet of a sooty shearwater stick out past the tail past its tail, and short-tailed shearwater, the feet stick past the tail of short-tailed shearwater too. So not a particularly useful field mark. They're smaller body. They're less wing loading, makes them a more graceful and agile flyer. They seem to and I know they're I don't want to lead anybody astray as far as identification goes, but often when a sooty shearwaters, both sooties and short tails, will come to a boat if chum is being thrown overboard, and the way that a short-tailed shearwater turns to come to the boat is something to notice, especially when you can compare it to the more work that a sooty shearwater has to do the same thing. Here's a short-tailed shearwater on the right. I actually had another picture of the short-tailed shearwater in here, and then an hour ago I was going through my presentation. I was like, I kind of think this might be a sooty, so I'm just going to delete it. And then I said, no, I shouldn't delete it. I'll just move it to the next page. And so there's this bird, and I'm actually not sure what it is. It was sent to me as a short-tailed shearwater, and I figured if it is a short-tailed shearwater, that's great. If it's not, it's at least a good bird for learning, and a demonstration that even with really good pictures and hey, even really good looks out in the ocean, not all of these can be or should be identified. This one, it doesn't seem to have any obvious streaks in the along the veins of the primary covert feathers on the underwing. It does seem to have a pretty uniform bar of white on the underwing, but it also doesn't have its wings fully extended, and it's kind of weird light, so I can't really tell. The forehead looks pretty slopey, and the bill looks pretty heavy to me for a short-tailed shearwater, but I'm not sure. So I just threw it in here just to show that it's not easy. But here's a few more clear short-tailed shearwaters. Top left, bottom left, the birds on the water with pretty classic steep forehead and small slender bill. A bird picking up on the right. Again, can't really tell too much about the underwing. Looks pretty muted, not bright and bold like one would expect on a sooty, but again, not the most reliable field mark. Just another one to have in the arsenal when looking at these things. The other all dark shearwater we have is a little more, actually it's a lot more straightforward. It's a big one, flesh-footed shearwater. It's uncommon. We get them probably peak in October or so, often with the pink-footed and sooty shearwaters, like in the straits around the Channel Islands, usually a little further offshore. And yeah, with other shearwaters, it's about the same size as a pink-footed shearwater. and like pink-footed shearwater, has pink feet, a pink bill with a dark tip. It's all chocolate brown, like a sooty shearwater, except it doesn't have the markings on the underwings, the flashes of white on the underwings, like sooty shearwater, short-tailed shearwater does. Also, it's got pink bill and pink feet, which neither of them have as well. So it's a pretty distinctive bird. Shouldn't be an ID problem unless you're trying to either string it into some rare dark pterodroma, or you get it confused with like a Heermann's gull or something like that, because it's roughly the color of a juvenile Heermann's gull. So yeah, and so moving from shearwaters to northern fulmar, this is a pretty distinctive tube nose. It's in its own genus, and we have northern fulmar here in the northern Pacific. Here's three different. It's polymorphic, as you can tell from this photograph. There's a pretty dark one on the right, a pretty old, just about as light as they get on the left, and kind of a in-betweener there in the with its back to us, kind of a cream-colored one. This, unlike the other tube noses I've spoken of, breeds to the north of us. They breed up in Arctic cliffs, and then they disperse south in the winter. So most of the time when we do have any around, they're in the October to March range. Sometimes we get them. Immature birds or birds in serious molt will stay the summer. They're pretty eruptive though. Some years there's lots of them out there, and in other years there's hardly any. This past winter there was a couple around, but I didn't see a whole lot of them, which I guess seems like sort of a normal winter. They have a pretty thick, heavy-looking bill. The plates on the bill are very well defined. They've got a big head and a thick neck, a little more, say, pterodroma-like than shearwaters are. They fly with very stiff wing beats, kind of like say like band-tailed pigeon or something like that. Kind of shallow, stiff wing beats. I have lots of good pictures of them because they eat garbage and they like to come to boats. So they will get pretty close and confiding. And then also, like I said, sometimes in the summertime, you get birds that are in heavy molt or seriously worn, and don't really want to fly. So often can get very close to them. So here's just fulmars and some different color morphs and some different postures. This one on the left, and pretty typical stance with its wings, very straight winged, in a banking turn. The one on the top right is kind of have its wings angled, sort of pterodroma style, but a big chunky head and big chunky bill. Bottom right, kind of a darker looking fulmar in primary molt. But usually not an identification problem. So moving on to the third type of petrel are the pterodroma petrels, and these are some of the, I guess, least encountered but most, say, sought after birds of birders of the area, I guess, because they're hard to get to, they're hard to identify. The places where they are usually really unpleasant, and that means that's why birders want to see them. They're also spectacular to watch, and this is a Murphy's petrel in a very like classic pterodroma-like stance. It's wheeling up in high wind. The pterodroma petrels have short necks, big heads, stout bills usually, and typically their wings are slanted slightly at on the carpal, giving them a little bit of a bent back wing. So, sort of the classic pterodroma stance. And the most readily encountered one is Cook's petrel. And they are, say fairly common if you can get to the place where they are, which is usually pretty far offshore, out on the shelf edge or the outer banks of the bight. We typically get them in the summer or early fall. These birds are all in wing molt. Sometimes we see lots of them, like these, are all over the water. Sometimes just see one kind of wheeling by. This is a small bird, smaller than a black-vented shearwater, but a very different flyer than black-vented shearwater. Typical with birds, these pterodromas with very low wing loading, is they float on the air, and they wheel and bank, flying sort of erratically, usually low over the water, but occasionally arcing up pretty high. These stand out pretty well in this blue water, but in gray water, against a different kind of light, they can blend in really well with their surroundings. This is a typical looking Cook's petrel from the back, gray on the back, sort of muted dark M pattern, dark tip tail, little white supercilium, and kind of a slender black bill. From below, they're pretty striking white. A little bit of black on the forewing and into the secondary coverts. Like other pterodroma petrels, they'll hold their feet inside their undertail coverts, so you're not going to see them. You're not going to see their feet sticking out or out past their tail or hanging out or anything. They'll keep them tucked in. The one on the right is in molt. I also took it kind of low light, so it gives the impression of being darker than it is, but you can still see a white supercilium and kind of a fine bill. There are a few other things that are similarly plumage to this that are possible in our waters, things like Steineger's petrel and even, which is a similar size, or mottled petrel, which is much bigger, look vaguely similar. And then there's a bunch of other ones that are out in the Pacific, further out in the tropical Pacific, that I don't want to deal with. But this is our say most common or most typically regularly detected pterodroma petrel. Probably the next one out, a regularly occurring bird off of Southern California. It's probably regularly occurring. I guess the way we wouldn't exactly know if it's regularly occurring is because the place and time that it regularly occurs is just about the worst place you would ever want to be, which is spring, when the northwest winds are raging their hardest out past the shelf edge. So you can kind of get an idea from what the ocean looks like in the background of this bird, of what this trip was like. And there's probably a few people on this seminar who remember this trip and still shiver about it in their sleep. But an all dark pterodroma petrel, vaguely similar to a sooty shearwater, but with a significantly less wing loading, a much smaller body. You can see how small bodied it is for the size of the wings. It does have white flashes in the bases of the primaries, otherwise all sort of a gray-brown color. And like pterodromas, the wings slightly cocked at the carpal at the wrist, so pointed back slightly, thick neck, and a stout bill. You can see a little bit of a white on the white sort of frosting on the chin, typical of Murphy's petrel, and different from some of the other very similar other dark petrels that I guess are potential in our waters. So here, the back of a Murphy's petrel. Again, cockback wings. I guess it sort of does have a little bit of a muted M pattern on it. Thick neck and stout bill. So moving on from the petrels to the storm petrels, and probably some of the most aggravating pelagic birds. So here we go. This storm petrels are particularly difficult because these are small birds. Black storm petrel is smaller than a kestrel, and the least storm petrel is about the size of a little bit bigger than a barn swallow. So these are tiny little things. Many of them have essentially the same plumage, either maybe potentially like essentially an all brown bird, or they're brown with a white band in their upper tail coverts. And then a lot of times, while they're small, they're moving fast. Sometimes the seas aren't very accommodating. You know, you're on a moving boat; they're really difficult to see. And subtle, even not so subtle plumage characteristics just aren't visible. So, of all the tube noses that I'm going to talk about, there's probably no group where it's more important to just learn and watch how these birds fly and move and how they're shaped than storm petrels. So there's three species in this one. Most of these birds are black storm petrels. There's a least storm petrel in the sort of lower center, and an ashy storm petrel sort of to the in the upper right there. So when you can see a few of them together, that's great. You can get an idea of relative size and shape and color and all of that, and then some of that stuff becomes pretty useful. But a lot of times, you might just see one at a time, and that's a challenge, and sometimes more than a challenge. Sometimes it just means you just don't get to identify it. The one we encounter the most, or the one that's the most numerous, is black storm petrel. That's sort of a relatively local breeder. They breed as far north as the Channel Islands, mostly breed in Mexico. They're here through the breeding season, through summer and the fall, and disperse out to sea, head south. This is our largest locally occurring storm petrel. It's an all dark storm petrel. It's kind of long-necked and long-tailed. It has very deep wing strokes, by which it brings its wings up high over its back on the upstroke and low down over its belly on the downstroke. Kind of a fast and erratic flight, but with those deep wing strokes. So here's a few pictures of black storm petrels in different lights and conditions, but you can see the sort of give an idea of what I mean by a wing stroke in the center and the right pictures. The birds bringing their wings way up high and then way down low. And you can get an idea of the proportions of these birds as well. Head sticks out pretty far from the front of the bird, and it has a forked tail, but a pretty long forked tail. And again, our probably the most numerous of the storm petrels, particularly south. So if you're going off of San Diego, sometimes run into flocks of thousands of these things off of places like the 30-mile bank. Least storm petrel, also sometimes pretty numerous. Here's a picture of a few of them with black storm petrels. This is definitely one of those birds that's like basically looks just like a black storm petrel, but is half the size. If you can see them together, which they often are, especially in places like the 30-mile bank, where there might be thousands of least storm petrels mixed with thousands of black storm petrels. So the relative size can be pretty helpful. They are, again, a uniformly dark storm petrel. The difference, and I'll show it, they also fly very much like a black storm petrel with deep wing beats and a pretty erratic flight. These pictures are two good pictures. They show the wedge-shaped tail of a least storm petrel, which, if you can actually see this, which isn't a thing that you can see very easily at sea. These pictures are much closer than you often get to a least storm petrel. You can see this wedge-shaped tail, which is different than any of the other ones. However, to add to the confusion is a wedge-shaped tail can, in a different storm petrel, can sometimes be the product of molting tail feathers. So it's always like this, and well, pretty much every other identification in birding is best to do with multiple features. But if you see a tiny little storm petrel with a wedge-shaped tail, that's a least storm petrel. And if you can see it with black storm petrels or pretty much any other storm petrel, it's smaller than all of them. So it's really, that's very helpful. Ashy storm petrel, I suppose, could be one of our more distinctive ones. It's another one of the all dark storm petrels. These pictures, different birds, different times, show these are pretty distinctive ashy storm petrels, sort of showing the ashiness, the sort of frosty color to their plumage, especially on the upper tail coverts, contrasting with the tail and the back feathers. Ashy storm petrels are also sort of local breeders. They breed north along the Pacific coast, but as far south as the Channel Islands. And they're here, mostly in the fall, but they can probably see them all year round somewhere. We usually see them a little bit further offshore, maybe the Santa Barbara Channel, but a little bit further off around the Channel Islands and the banks. And they like colder water than some of these other ones that are like Lee's storm petrel, which comes up from Mexico with warm water. But again, with all the similarities in plumage, in fact, I'll just go to this page, which makes it a lot more confusing because these don't show the fresh sort of frosty tones to the feathers. These look brown, just like all the other storm petrels. So what you're looking for in ashy storm petrel, if you can see it, is pale underwings or pale underwing, some pale covert feathers. So sometimes you can see that, these pale tips and the covert feathers. They have a very different flight style especially from black and least, in that they have a more fluttery flight, a little less jerky and erratic. Shape-wise, they also have a forked tail. They have a pretty like short neck, and their head sticks right out of their shoulders, and a relatively short bill, which is visible in both of these photos. And actually, let me back it up one more. I just want to, I can't see it in that one. Never mind. So moving on to the next dark storm petrel is Chapman's Leach's storm petrel, and I put this one up here particularly because it could be confused with ashy storm petrel, and this one looks looks a lot like an ashy storm petrel in the posture that it has. Looks short necked, it looks big headed and short billed. So there are certainly, going by photos, there is plenty of room for confusion. The Chapman's Leach's storm petrel is sort of a local breeder, breeds mostly off of Mexico. Maybe it breeds as far, I don't think it breeds as far north as the Channel Islands, but it's these dark rumped Leach's storm petrels they're the Leach's storm petrels that we see the most here. Typically see them pretty far offshore, though. This isn't a bird that we see in, say, the Santa Barbara Channel very often, or in inside of the Channel Islands. Tend to have to get offshore to the outer banks or to the shelf edge. They have a dark rump, but the amount of the dark of their rump is pretty variable. This bird has a couple little white corners on the rump. Let's see if I can get my cursor right here. And sometimes have a little bit more white than that. Leach's storm petrel flight is pretty distinctive. It's often described and well described as bounding and nighthawk like. They kind of bounce around and like the way nighthawks feed over a pond. So and that's a really good description. I can't make up a better one than that. And seeing these things, that's really helpful. Now, the Leach's storm petrels, Chapman's Leach's storm petrel, this dark rumped one, the nominate Leach's storm petrel, the white rumped one, and then the more recent split taxon, the Townsend storm petrel, all kind of have that flight style. I don't know if I can say for certain between those based on their flight style, but that bounding nighthawk like flight is a good way to at least get into the Leach's camp and away from some of the other ones. So here's a couple other pictures of Chapman's Leach's storm petrels, various amounts of white on the rumps. mostly dark, but little corners or little smudges along the sides, pretty typical of Chapman's Leach's storm petrel. The nominate Leach's storm petrel is the one that breeds north of here, and it breeds down as far as the Channel Islands, I think. And we see these particularly in the spring, way out, like over the shelf edge and outer banks. So don't see these too much further inshore than that. Again, that bounding nighthawk-like flight, forked tail, and usually a bright white rump, oftentimes with a central dark line down the rump, and then dark feather shafts visible on those white feathers. That's at least visible in like photos. My picture here isn't nearly good enough to see that, but you can see some of that in Larry's picture here. That dark line down the center of the rump, and a deeply forked tail. The one on the right shows some more of the characteristics of the white rump that doesn't wrap around all the way into the undertail coverts like it would on, say, a white rump storm petrel like Wilson's storm petrel or wedge rump storm petrel. So Townsend storm petrel is sort of our newest storm petrel to Southern California, in that it was fairly recently split from Leach's storm petrel, and this breeds very locally off of Guadalupe Island in Mexico. And we get these in the summer and into the fall, usually over the outer banks inside of the continental shelf. And it's a lot like Leach's storm petrel. They usually have white rumps, but they are both light white rumped and dark rumped morphs of this bird. So the white rumped birds tend to be pretty distinctive. The white of the white rump is usually very bold and occupies like a very distinct band across the rump. So sometimes these things jump out when you're seeing a flock of storm petrels. Like, oh, well, there's a really white rumped one. You might be thinking it was something, maybe even like a Wilson storm petrel or something like that. But it's these Townsend's storm petrels. They're different from the Leach's and Chapman's in being a little bit smaller, a little bit darker, less contrasting with these pale carpal bars on the upper wing. A little bit rounder winged, tail's not quite as forked, but it's a bird it's not an easy identification. It does require some watching, and sometimes these things get away, and sometimes I take pictures of something that I think is or isn't a Townsend storm petrel, and then have to change my mind later. So that happens. Here's a dark rump Townsend storm petrel. Again, showing some of the features, sort of a shallowly forked tail. I think this one might have some molt things going on as well. Sort of roundish wings, and otherwise a dark brown bird. So moving on to storm petrels, from the little things to the great big things. Time to talk about albatrosses. Unlike storm petrels, albatrosses tend to be pretty easy to see. They're great big birds. You can see them here with some western gulls. They're significantly bigger than a western gull. They often approach boats. They eat garbage. So they come into chum and to fishing boats and things like that. So usually you can get good looks and good photographs of them. And the ones that occur around here are pretty easy to identify. And there's really just the two. There's black-footed albatross, and there's Laysan albatross. Laysan albatross is a very sharp-looking bird. Sort of gives the impression of a great big gull, that's got a big bill, and I can't see the cool nostrils on this bird, but their tube noses are on the sides of their nose rather than on the top of their nose. Our black and white albatross, basically, that we're likely to see here. They're fairly uncommon off of Southern California. Got to get out pretty far, usually at the shelf edge, maybe the outer banks, where you get these things. Usually seen them in the throughout the year, so seen in the spring and over, through into the fall, but usually pretty far out. You can see its short tail and its toes sticking out the back. There's a couple more views of Lace albatross, white bodied, kind of distinctive mottled color underneath. Unlike some albatrosses, including black-footed albatross, ages not really apparent. No major plumage differences in the ages. So that's pretty cool. Black-footed albatross, probably which is our more common albatross, which we see spring through fall. I mean, maybe they're off a year-round, way out at the shelf edge. You got to get out pretty far to see them. And I guess like all albatrosses or these albatrosses, they're birds. These are birds flying from potentially Hawaii or Japan or something, covering huge distances. So they want to be in the windiest places so that they don't have to do as much work flying around. Interestingly, both black-footed and lace albatrosses are fairly recent colonizers to islands off of Mexico. Maybe their numbers are also increasing in our waters if they're feeding around here. Now you can see the nostrils on this bird very distinctly. Distinctive dark albatross, kind of dusky build. The ages of black-footed albatross are different. That older birds get white on the around the tail, the undertail coverts and upper tail coverts. I couldn't find any of my photos that had an adult bird. Most of the birds, the black-footed albatrosses that we see are young birds, a year or two old, so they don't have any white on the undertail coverts or upper tail coverts. But some of them we do get some older birds that sometimes that'll show that. But otherwise, the ages look the same. And then I want to close with sort of the weirdsies. These are the birds that I just didn't have the time to talk about, and also are in many ways beyond. They're beyond this talk, and also beyond my skill level and my experience. I've seen many of these, but not all of them. And the ones I have seen, I've only seen a couple of times. But this I just threw this up here. These are birds these are all things that have been accepted by the California Bird Records Committee. I had to kind of cut it off somewhere because there's some other things like there's like bulwers. There's a bulwers petrel. Potentially a bulwers petrel from the Salton Sea, and there were another one that wasn't accepted off of Southern California out in the ocean, Tristram storm petrel, and like a few other odds and ends in here that were not accepted that were probably good, but I had to cut it somewhere. But this just to give an idea of the distribution of sort of the rarities. Now it might be that in July and August and September that's when the most boats are going out, but it does seem to be when a lot of the weirdest things are showing up here. And not all of these are things that are like 100 miles offshore. The Newell shearwater was from land. The Juanines petrel was caught in a storm petrel burrow. The gray-faced petrel, great winged petrel, is seen from La Jolla. So many of these are things that were seen from shore. Some of them are from way out there, things like Steineger's petrel and stuff. Mottled petrel are things that are way far offshore. But just these are the other ones. Now, just some, this is just the last, my sort of closing eye candy slide of rare things off Southern California that I wanted to close with. But I also wanted to throw out there that eventually, and at date as yet undetermined, I will try to continue this into Seabirds Part 2 and cover whatever else I can cover in approximately an hour. So that's it. Thank you all for listening to me.
John, that was fantastic. I think everyone really enjoyed it immensely. I'm going to let you catch your breath a little bit. And what was my Harrison is 40 years old now. What do you recommend as a more current? That's because of your background. It's kind of, yeah.
All right. Yeah, I don't know if you can. Yeah, my background's doing weird things to this, but yes, I will. I will plug again, as I did in the beginning. Steve Howell's Petrels, Albatrosses, and Storm-petrels of North America. Like I said, I didn't want this to sound too much like a book report on
Right.
that book,
Right.
but anything, probably everything that I covered, and then tons more is going to be in that book. And yeah, I think Harrison just published a newer version of his book. I don't have it yet, but I'll defer to
Okay.
somebody.
Okay. Sounds good. Um, we do have a number of questions. The first question is, do you know how shearwaters got their name?
Well, I don't know who named them shearwaters. It's probably like an old mariner name or something. I think I have a picture in the presentation somewhere of a shearwater in one of its turns actually cutting the water with its outer primary feathers. And
Shearing the water.
yeah, yeah, and
Neat.
as I don't know, which salty sea dog decided to name it that, but it's a good name and it stuck.
That's good. That's good. Laura asks, calling a dark morph Townsend storm petrel from a Chapmani leeches seems like a tenuous exercise, excuse me. So calling
Yes.
it, yeah, tenacious,
Yes, yes,
tenuous.
100%. Yeah, and I don't, it's hard, when you're giving a presentation about identification and showing pictures of birds to say like, well, and I don't know what this one is, and I don't know what that one is, and I think this is probably that. But again, I will refer back to back to Steve's book, and many photos in his book are labeled things like presumed Townsend storm petrel, and that's probably the way most of these things should be labeled, because yeah, it's really hard, and it's hard to get a long enough, good enough look at something to say, oh, that's really different. It must be this. Yes, so not just dark rumped Townsends from Chapman's leeches, but lots of things are a tenuous exercise.
Um, okay, well, let me hold off on that. Lance asks, among the tube noses, what's changed that's, can't even speak. What's changed the most in Southern California waters in the last 20 years or so among tube
Um,
noses?
hard to say, because I'm just the, at least from my my personal observation, is just as it's just anecdotal. I
Mhm.
go out and see things, and then go out another time and don't see things. Um, I I feel like I see fewer pink-footed shearwaters than I used to. I feel like 15, 20 years ago, going in the fall, going out and seeing flocks of hundreds or thousands of shearwaters just around the Channel Islands seemed normal, and I don't feel like I'm
Seeing
seeing
that.
that anymore.
Yeah.
But I wish I could answer that better. Somebody who's like somebody who does real seabird science should probably answer that one.
Yeah, but that certainly is the impression we're getting on of many things and all that. John LaBelle points out that yes, Lynx has just published the revised Harrison. It's very good. I guess John has a copy. Drawings are much better in revised text, just released a few weeks ago. So you can check out Lynx Publishing for that. And do you offhand know of any good instructional videos, John, when it comes to studying markings and size and patterns and
No, I
that?
don't. And if somebody knows on the chat, I'd be interested in hearing
Yeah.
that as well. It's yeah, this is all identifying seabirds is, well, it's like, and I'm sure Desi will talk about this in his talk, is it's a lot of it is just staring at these things and getting a general impression. where we're looking at hawks. You can stand on the side of a highway and watch a red tail wheel around. Watching something like a storm petrel is a lot more difficult. But the more you stare at them, the more sense it makes.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have another question from Alvaro Jaramillo. Alvaro asks, have the storm petrel flocks in Southern California remained pretty stable and in the same general areas, or are they no longer, excuse me, they are no longer in Monterey Bay. They have moved north off Half Moon and Bodega Bay. So I wonder if they have been stable in the south. Do you know
Mm.
offhand?
Good question. The big flocks of storm petrels that we've encountered in Southern California have always been off of San Diego. We get flocks of them in the northern part of the Southern California bight too, but the flocks of thousands, usually black at least, are off San Diego. And I haven't been off San Diego in a few years, so I don't know if they're still seeing those, but it would be getting into that season, say September-ish area when they'd be around. So I don't know about very recent, like in the last few years, but certainly, as of, between 5 and 10 years ago, there were still flocks of storm petrels.
Yeah. And
and I see a comment about pink-footed shearwaters.
right. And he, yeah,
cool.
so he says, by the way, pink-footed shearwaters are actually probably increasing recently after removal of rabbits from Santa Clara Island and more conservation efforts on Mocha Island. Where's Mocha Island?
It's off of Chile.
Okay.
That's the breeding. I don't exactly know where it is, but I know that's where they the islands that these things nest on. That's good news. Pink-footed shearwater is it's one of our common shearwaters, but as far as like global numbers go, is not a common shearwater. That's one of those things that we take for granted is, well, we go offshore and see them, so that means they're common, but they're actually not a common bird. So it's encouraging that they're doing that conservation work.
Yeah. Lily, one of our student birders, asks, what time of year do we have to go? Excuse me. What time of year do we have the most tube noses off our coast?
Yeah, well, numbers or diversity. Probably if you want to just see lots of them, sometime in the winter is great to look for black-finnet shearwaters. You don't even have to go that far off the coast. As far as diversity goes, I always like, say, mid-August and September mid-September is a really good time to be offshore. Lots of possibilities, and all of the regular ones are there. So that's a really good time for diversity. Sooty shearwaters can arrive in some pretty huge numbers in the spring. So sometimes you get offshore not very far and see thousands of sooty shearwaters. And of course the overall numbers vary from year to year as with just the wave in ocean variations. So, but I'd say diversity. Yeah, get out now.
Yeah. Well, sounds good. Sounds good. And I think we're running out of questions, John. Mark, do you have anything that you would like to add before we wrap up?
Oh, thank you very much, John. I was one of the seasick birders on that Murphy's Petrel thing, and I still shiver from memories of that trip, as you know. So fantastic. One other, since nobody else asked, on your last slide, what are the rare tube noses that we are looking at on your last slide?
Oh, there's a the top bar photo is a wedge-rumped storm petrel on the with black and leasts on the 30-mile bank. Directly below that is a Hawaiian petrel. To the left of that is a Wilson storm petrel and fork-tailed storm petrels, and to the far right is another Wilson storm petrel.
Fantastic.
So I think most of those are in LA County, but maybe the fork-tailed. It might have been one of those years when there were a bunch of fork-tailed storm petrels for that lower left one.
We did have another question that came in. It says that I read some seabirds use nasal tubes to gauge air pressure and thus air speed. Do tube noses do this in addition to salt excretion? Do you know?
Good question. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, the more sensory awareness that a seabird, that a tube nose can have, the more it would be advantageous, to find food out in the open ocean. So that would not, that would not surprise me if they could detect things like pressure and other sort of weather related things to find stuff. So
Excellent.
sorry, I don't know the answer. I just made that up.
Yes, but it sounded very, very, very astute, very good. Anyways, John, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. We are so much looking for part two, looking forward for part two. Uh, sh- uh, and we so again, thank you very, very much, John.
Right.
Next week we do have Desi Seaworth here, who will be talking about hawks in flight, and so we're actually looking forward to that. And we may find a lot of similarities to what John actually talked about tonight. So thank you very much for warming us up for that. And again, you can go to our website at www.labirders.org and see this present webinar once again, plus all the other webinars, most of the other webinars we've presented. And Mark, is there anything I'm missing?
Nope, I think that's it. Thank you very much, John.
Yeah,
Fantastic
thank you.
presentation.
That was really fantastic, John. Really.
Welcome.
Mhm.
Can't wait to
Absolutely.
get out in the ocean again now.
Yeah, hopefully, thank you, Mark. Hopefully, we'll be arranging that in a short bit. And let me just make sure that we didn't miss anything, and we didn't. And with that, I hope to see all of you next week. I know John will be here and Mark will be here, and I hope all of you can join us. Tell your friends to join, and we'll see you next week. Good night, everyone.
Good
Good
night.
night.